Chapter 31. So, we need to find a way for Duncan to free every boy in the camp, which means him making contact with each boy at least briefly, asked Ben, wanting the point clarified. Yeah, I don't know how to do it without making contact, he answered as he practiced sheathing his sand sword in the ground before reaching down and creating a fresh one. Now that he knew the structure, the feel of it, he could create it instantly, without too much thought. Roptek had informed them that when he had visited the camp to pick up fresh recruits in the past, the number of boys could be as low as 20, or as high as 400 or 500. Duncan wasn't sure which he would prefer. He wanted to free as many boys as possible, as soon as possible, but it would be much easier if there were fewer. Sam looked to Roptek with a new question. What about goblins? How many goblins are there likely to be? It was Ben that answered. I think about 20 if Pelkar is here. Maybe 15 if he's not. He usually has a small group of them with him, his underlings. Duncan supposed that Ben must have also passed through here a few times to collect new recruits for whatever unit he was serving in at the time. He saw Roptek nod in agreement at the answer. So what's the plan? Asked Finn. There was a brief silence before Ben spoke. We enter the camp and each get as close to a goblin as possible, but not so close that they immediately order us out of the way. Then, on a given signal, we all strike at the same time to kill all of the goblins. Several of the boys in the vicinity murmured their consent. Duncan didn't like the idea of killing, but it was the simplest plan and therefore the best. Even Roptek agreed, having no concerns at killing fellow goblins, although Duncan reminded himself that interclan wars had been common among goblins. Then we work together to mop up any remaining resistance, while Roptek orders every boy he sees to lay on the ground and not move while Duncan starts freeing them. They looked to Duncan. He knew that nothing could work without him, so the decision was his. He accepted. Very well. We'll get up an hour before dawn, march to the camp and enter a little after dawn. So they went to their blankets that night, but Duncan had only fitful sleep. He was already awake when the call went out to get up and get ready. They still had supplies taken from Ben's camp for their breakfast, but they ate only lightly before beginning their march. The rising sun revealed their target, the same camp Duncan had woken in a couple of weeks earlier, before he had learned to use magic and come to lead a small army. He briefly wondered if Oliver, the boy he had failed to free on the night that he had escaped with Charlie and Finn, was still in the camp, but he had too many other things to worry about. They marched in through the main gate. Roptek sat on Ben's shoulder, briefly greeting the guards, which included 2 goblins. As they went through the gate, 2 boys from Duncan's force broke off and made themselves look busy near the gate. As they made their way through the camp, they saw 3 goblins sat together, drinking snot juice. 3 more boys peeled off to loiter in that area while trying to avoid the notice of the goblins. Then 2 more, followed by a group of 5. When they reached the centre of the camp, the boys remaining in Duncan's force spread out. There were 2 goblins there, sat writing under a canopy. They looked like the camp commander and his underling. Duncan, Charlie, Finn and Sam settled themselves nearby with Ben and Roptek. As agreed on the march, the other boys fanned out through the camp. Duncan and his closest companions would take care of the 2 goblins here, then respond to any remaining problems. The other boys had less than 2 minutes to find a goblin to target. They didn't want to wait any longer than that for fear of being discovered. Duncan looked around a little, avoiding looking directly at the 2 busy goblins. There was no sign of Pelkar. Roptek believed he visited regularly to enslave fresh boys. If he was not here, they would prepare an ambush for his next visit. Duncan began counting in his head. When he got to 100, he would call out to his friends throughout the camp. 7, 8, 9.
Hey, you! Roptek, isn't it?
A goblin called out, apparently recognizing Duncan's one-armed ally.
Have your boys do something useful. We can't afford to laze around this morning. Pelkar will be here any moment with King Umkar himself. The camp must be impeccable and ready to receive hundreds of the Kingsguard.
Duncan's heart skipped a beat as he saw Roptek's eyes go wide with surprise or fear, possibly both. They couldn't have launched their attack at a worse time. The goblins could receive major reinforcements at any moment, and the Kingsguard didn't sound like they would be fresh recruits who could be easily defeated. 39, 40, 41. Duncan knew it was too late to abort the attack. His boys were scattered through the camp and awaiting his signal, and if they waited or tried to retreat, they would likely be discovered. They could only hope that they would have time to complete the first part of the plan and escape. 52, 53, 54. Sam and Charlie had been shuffling around the area pretending to inspect things, but it wasn't enough for the impatient goblin, who glared at them all and called out,
"You boys, go and dig some fresh latrines for the arriving soldiers. Immediately!"
To not obey immediately was to blow their cover, so Duncan knew his count wasn't going to reach 100. Sucking in a deep breath, he shouted,
"Now!"
The boys around him launched themselves towards the two goblins, drawing their weapons as they went. The two goblins wore expressions of confusion, then surprise, shock, and finally fear. Duncan looked away as the two tiny man-like creatures were cut down on his orders. He scanned around him for any signs of goblins or enslaved boys attacking on the orders of a goblin. Duncan and his small team were in the centre of the camp. To one side of him the camp was quiet, but on the other there was a lot of commotion. Having dealt with the immediate threat of the two goblins, Sam noticed it too and looked to Duncan. Drawing his sword, Duncan called his friends to follow and headed in the direction of all the noise. Duncan found a fight occurring. 8 of his force were in a small battle with about the same number of boys who stood defending 3 goblins, who were coordinating the defence, shouting out orders to the boys. As they arrived at the scene, Roptek shouted out orders to the boys in his scratchy goblin voice.
"Cease fighting and lay on the ground."
The closest 2 boys heard the order, but the din of the clashing blades kept the others from hearing it. Those 2 glanced over at Roptek as if to check that the order had indeed come from a goblin before dropping to the floor to lay still. But one of the 3 goblins under attack saw and heard the incident, and after shooting a hateful look towards Roptek, shouted at the boy,
"Get up and continue fighting. Kill the attackers."
With an apprehensive glare at Roptek, the goblin quickly added,
"All boys, take orders from no one but me."
In response, Roptek again shouted,
"Lay on the ground and cease fighting."
This time, there was a mixed response. The boys were now receiving countermanding orders from different goblins. Some boys, having been specifically ordered not to follow the orders from any other goblin, ignored the order. Others couldn't seem to decide which order had priority and just froze where they were, immobile. One boy began clutching his head and screaming as if he had the world's worst headache. Perhaps he does, thought Duncan. As more enslaved boys arrived at the scene, unsure what was happening, Roptek called to them, a race to be first.
"Lay on the ground. Do not move until sunset. Do not accept any new orders,"
he ordered, determined not to be outdone by his opposing goblins, and giving as specific orders as possible. Duncan watched the actions unfolding before him, as the boys of his own force fought in a deadly skirmish against the very boys they were attempting to rescue. It was somewhat awkward to watch. Duncan's force were attempting to avoid killing the boys they fought. The enslaved boys that continued to fight were younger and much less experienced, only just started with their training. The result was almost a stalemate, but more of Duncan's force were arriving, having succeeded in dispatching their targeted goblins. Most of the camp was secure. Duncan's force was surrounding the younger boys, and it couldn't be long before they were overpowered. Then a new noise could be heard. Drums. Lots of drums, and then the sound of synchronized footsteps marching in time with those drums. The Goblin King had arrived, with Pelkar and the King's Guard. It sounded like there were a lot of them, and they were coming quickly. The 3 surviving enemy goblins grinned as they realized their reinforcements had arrived. Charlie was stood next to Duncan and gave him a look of hopelessness. Looking around, he saw looks of despair or frustration on many faces, especially Sam, Ben and Roptek. The new enemy came into view, having entered the camp. Unlike the majority of boys he had seen employed in Umkar's army, these wore armour, fine, shining metal armour that made them look more professional and more deadly. The armour was a little peculiarly shaped in certain places. Then it hit him. "The King's Guard are girls!" he cried out loud. He saw his surprise mirrored in the faces of Charlie and Finn, but Sam just asked, "You didn't know that?" He seemed mildly amused for a moment, but it soon switched back to a depressing seriousness. "Not just any girls. Only the deadliest girls are in the King's Guard," Roptek asked in a grim voice.
"Duncan, you got any more special magic tricks to get us out of this?"
He didn't sound like he really expected anything. Duncan could only shake his head. Ben spoke defiantly. "I won't be enslaved again. I will die free. We need to find a better defensive position." He abandoned the fight against the few boys still defending the 3 resilient goblins. He retreated away a little to give himself some space. The other boys of Duncan's force responded to his initiative, following him. Duncan had little choice, and it seemed that at last all 35 of them stood together to face the rushing onslaught of the King's Guard as they attacked with weapons held high, screaming battle cries that seemed feminine in the most terrifying way. Stood together, the boys faced their fate.